The Siege of the Heart. The ferry from the mainland was overcrowded with the hollow-eyed survivors of the Narragansett country. Among them was Samuel Teft, a man whose name was currently a dark whisper in the ears of the United Colonies. He sought out the Jenks family, who had also sought refuge on the island. Joseph Jenks Sr. had set up a temporary forge, the rhythm of his hammer providing the only heartbeat of normalcy in a town swollen with refugees. It was there, against the backdrop of the Sakonnet River, that Samuel met Elizabeth. She was organizing supplies for the displaced families. When Samuel approached to offer his labor in exchange for news of the northern borders, she didn't look at him with the pity or suspicion he had grown used to. She looked at him with the calculating eyes of a woman who knew that a family's survival depended on its alliances. "They say the Puritans are looking to seize the Teft lands as forfeit," Elizabeth said quietly, leading him away from the heat of the forge toward the salt-sprayed bluffs. "They can look," Samuel replied, his voice raspy from the winter wind, "but the land belongs to my brother's son. I will not let it fall." In the weeks that followed, Portsmouth became their private world. While the mainland glowed with the distant fires of war, Samuel and Elizabeth walked the narrow lanes of the settlement. They sat near the Founder's Brook, planning a future that seemed impossible to most. Their romance was a series of tactical strikes against despair, discussing how the Jenks political weight could shield the Teft inheritance, and how Samuel's knowledge of the southern soil would rebuild what had been lost. By the time the spring thaws arrived in 1676, the refugee from Narragansett and the blacksmith's daughter were inseparable. They were married in a small, salt-weathered house in Portsmouth. There was no music, only the sound of the Atlantic crashing against the rocks. As they stood before the magistrate, Samuel took Elizabeth's hand, feeling the strength in it. In Portsmouth, they hadn't just survived a war. They had plotted a resurrection. They weren't just a husband and wife. They were the foundation of a new Rhode Island, one that would never forget its own. The silent descent. While the echoes of the execution were still fresh, the mood in Newport and Providence was not one of celebration, but of quiet, simmering resentment. To the Rhode Islanders, the Puritan soldiers were unwelcome intruders who had marched onto their land, burned their neighbors' homes, and executed one of their own without a local trial. A year later, in 1677, the stain on the Teft name seemed to vanish as if by magic. In a crowded colonial assembly, Joshua's brother, Samuel Teft, stood tall. Beside him was his brother-in-law, Joseph Jenkins, a man whose intellect and ambition would one day lead him to the governor's chair. As they were sworn in as freemen of the colony, there were no whispers of traitor's kin. Instead, there was a firm handshake and a seat at the table of power. The Restoration. The real drama, however, unfolded in 1681. Young Peter Teft, now 9 years old, stood in a wood-paneled room in Pettaquamscut. He was an orphan of a felon, a boy who, by all the laws of the British Empire, should have been a penniless ward of the state. But Rhode Island was a colony built on dissent. 3 men stepped forward to place their hands on the boy's shoulders, forming a shield of legal protection that the United Colonies could not pierce. Ira Bull, the local justice of the peace. John Green, the formidable leader from Warwick. Samuel Teft, the uncle who had never forgotten the brother he lost to the Puritan gallows. The court order did not read like a document of charity. It read like a declaration of war. It stated that Peter was the rightful owner of all his father's lands and possessions. The final word. By restoring the estate, the Rhode Island authorities were making a bold, wordless statement. To return a traitor's land was to declare that there had been no treason. They looked at the map of the Narragansett country, land the Puritans had tried to seize by blood, and they gave it back to the son of the man the Puritans had killed. In the eyes of Rhode Island, Joshua Teft wasn't a villain. He was a casualty of a war they hadn't wanted, judged by a law they didn't recognize. Joshua Teft's body had been divided by the executioner's blade, but his legacy was made whole again by a colony that preferred the messy truth of survival over the rigid certainty of the noose.